We often picture Napoleon Bonaparte as a romantic hero, a charismatic genius driven by destiny. But strip away the mythology, and what remains is a systems engineer. As an artillery officer, he looked at warfare not as an arena for individual glory, but as a problem of applied mathematics and kinetic energy. By December 1793, the French Republic was stalled at the southern port city of Toulon. British forces controlled the harbor, and conventional French infantry assaults against the fortified city walls were failing, bleeding manpower for zero strategic gain. Enter a 24-year-old artillery major. Bonaparte didn't view the battlefield as a clash of wills. He mapped it as a geographic grid. Instead of throwing infantry at impenetrable walls, he surveyed the topography to find the single fulcrum where applied leverage would crack the entire British defense. This map shows the geography of Toulon Harbor. Bonaparte identified a specific elevated land mass jetting into the water, the Montcaire Promontory. Capture that, and the geometry of the battle shifts entirely. Controlling Montcaire meant placing Admiral Hood's entire British fleet within the lethal range of French cannons. You don't need to breach the city walls if you can vaporize the ships supplying the city. Realizing their fleet was mathematically trapped, the British evacuated. At Toulon, Bonaparte demonstrated that artillery could be used to exploit specific geographic vulnerabilities, rather than slowly grinding down fortifications. By identifying the harbor's physical choke point, he forced a strategic evacuation with a fraction of the force usually required for a siege. 2 years later, that same spatial logic was applied to urban politics. In October 1795, the civilian government in Paris, the Directory, was collapsing. 30,000 armed royalist insurgents were marching on the capital to overthrow the Republic. Bonaparte was handed to Descends and the Tuileries Palace. He had exactly 5,000 regular soldiers to hold off 30,000 rebels. In a conventional infantry fight, he would be overrun in hours. He ignored the infantry deficit and prioritized hardware. He dispatched a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to secure 40 heavy cannons from a camp outside the city and drag them back to the palace gates. He treated the streets of Paris exactly like the harbor at Toulon. This map of the city grid shows his deployment. Instead of spreading his men thin, Bonaparte funneled the royalists into narrow avenues of approach, placing his artillery at the terminal ends of these urban choke points. He loaded the cannons with grape shot, tightly packed iron spheres that burst from the barrel like a massive shotgun blast. When the insurgents charged, Bonaparte fired into the enclosed streets. The geometry of the architecture contained the blast, sending thousands of musket balls ricocheting off the stone walls. The rebellion was neutralized in 2 hours. By solving a political crisis through calculated artillery placement, Bonaparte cemented his position within the civilian government. He had successfully applied military utility to secure political power. By the spring of 1796, that influence earned Bonaparte command of the Army of Italy. It was a hollow promotion. This force of 40,000 men was mutinous, starving, and intended only as a secondary diversion against the Austrian Empire. This visualization highlights the stark logistical deficit the French faced. The Austrian military was built en masse, relying on vast, slow-moving supply wagons. The French Army of Italy had a grand total of 200 mules. The soldiers were unpaid and completely shoeless. Bonaparte turned this deficiency into an operational feature. He abandoned the static supply chain tethered to Paris. Instead, he ordered his army into constant, rapid forward motion, sustaining themselves by actively foraging and plundering the rich agricultural plains of the Piedmont. Speed was essential because of the tactical reality on the ground. The French were facing a massive Austro-Piedmontese coalition. The enemy had superior numbers, but crucially, their forces were divided into 2 distinct armies. Bonaparte utilized defeat in detail via internal lines. With superior speed, the French marched squarely into the gap between the Austrian and Piedmontese armies. Bonaparte broke the Piedmontese on his left, pivoted 180 degrees, and launched his mass against the Austrians. He fought 2 numerically superior armies and achieved local superiority in both engagements. Extreme operational mobility had negated the enemy's total aggregate mass. Pressing the advantage, the French pursued the retreating Austrians eastward into the Po Valley. On May 10, 1796, they encountered the Austrian rearguard at the town of Lodi. Looking at the tactical layout of Lodi, the Austrian defense was firmly anchored behind a severe geographic obstacle, a 180-meter wooden bridge spanning the Adda River. On the eastern bank, an arc of Austrian artillery had the choke point completely dialed in.
Rather than immediately feeding infantry into a kill zone, Bonaparte brought his own artillery rapidly to the western riverbank. He initiated a highly concentrated, localized counterbarrage to suppress the Austrian guns. Wading into the mud to personally aim cannons bound the infantry to him psychologically. The moment Austrian fire slackened under the French counterbarrage, Bonaparte ordered his vanguard forward. They surged across the narrow bridge before the enemy could reload, breaking the Austrian line. Lodi proved that Bonaparte's system was a hybrid engine. It required a commander possessing both the cold calculus to map artillery trajectories and the psychological magnetism to inspire bravery from the front line. The entire Italian campaign eventually hinged on a single geographic anchor, the heavily fortified city of Mantua, where the French had trapped a massive Austrian garrison. Mantua effectively became bait. The Austrian high command could not afford to lose the city, forcing them to repeatedly launch isolated relief armies down from the Alps to break the siege. Holding this siege required months of frantic counterattacks. In November 1796, Bonaparte only managed to repel one of these relief columns by turning the Austrian flank in the flooded marshes of Arcole. The ultimate stress test of this system arrived in January 1797 at the Battle of Rivoli. It stands as the absolute execution of the internal lines doctrine. This map illustrates the Austrian strategy, multiple divided columns creeping through alpine passes to surround the French. Bonaparte countered with velocity. Marching relentlessly through the night, he pushed his troops to the exact center, establishing a consolidated core before the trap could snap shut. Because the Austrians were separated by mountains, they arrived at the center sequentially, rather than simultaneously. Striking outward from his dense central position, Bonaparte dismantled the uncoordinated columns one by one. The fall of Mantua concluded a campaign where velocity and geometry dismantled a traditional, supply-heavy empire. A force with no shoes and no wagons had effectively paralyzed the primary military power of Central Europe. Following the success in Italy, Bonaparte sought to formalize these improvisational battlefield tactics into a standardized, macro-level field command style. The result was the bataillon carré, or the square formation. This diagram illustrates the concept. Rather than a localized defensive infantry tactic, this was a massive operational marching formation composed of multiple independent army corps moving fluidly as a grid across the theater of war. This framework allowed the French corps to travel widely dispersed, which drastically eased the logistical burden of foraging for food. Yet, because of their geometric arrangement, the moment one corps made contact with the enemy, the others could instantly pivot and concentrate into a massive offensive mass. In 1798, Bonaparte deployed this system in Egypt, facing a different threat, the elite Mamluk cavalry. This campaign tested his organizational grid under extreme combat conditions. To neutralize the speed of the cavalry, Bonaparte deployed his infantry in deeply packed squares. He positioned his artillery explicitly at the corners of these formations. This created a 360-degree mobile defense perimeter, offering intersecting fields of fire that shredded the Mamluk charges from every angle. The Mamluk cavalry was annihilated. Bonaparte had taken the heaviest, slowest component of early modern warfare, the artillery, and transformed it into a highly mobile, deeply integrated asset of maneuver warfare. Tactical brilliance in the field inevitably bleeds into geopolitical power. By the end of the 1797 Italian campaign, Bonaparte's unbroken string of victories had effectively paralyzed the weak Directory government setting back in Paris. Marching his army to within striking distance of the Austrian capital of Vienna, he stopped waiting for instructions. Bonaparte completely bypassed French civilian diplomats and opened direct negotiations with the Austrian Empire. The result was the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797. He used the physical proximity of his undefeated, highly mobile army as unilateral leverage. He extracted massive territorial concessions and vast amounts of wealth from the Austrians, wealth that he shipped back to single-handedly fund the French state. This map illustrates how the treaty physically redrew the borders of Europe. It pushed Austrian influence back, carving northern Italy into a buffer zone of French-aligned satellite republics, completely loyal to their conqueror. The transition from artillery officer to international negotiator was complete. Bonaparte had integrated military maneuver with statecraft, creating a new model of power where the commanding general and the head of state were now inextricably one.